So a 7:45 breakfast on campaign finance law.
I didn't know if anybody
It's what
was
I
going to be
it's
here.
what I love to it's what I live for. I thought you had some interesting takes. You talked about dark money, super PACs. Obviously, this has all kind of been an issue on the national level. On the state level, also, obviously, legislators have to raise money, this and that. Are you seeing, with the added spotlight on this, things getting worse in terms of disclosures, candidates? We know on a national level are spending half their time on fundraising. What are you seeing in terms of increased transparency or not so much?
Well, I think what's happening at the federal level, we're seeing seep into the state and local level. Some of the most outrageous examples of these single candidate super PACs are actually happening at the state and local level, where you see brothers-in-law or mothers or, former staffers or that kind of thing. So it's actually happening at the state and local level. What we often see is someone does something at the federal level and then everybody says, wow, they got away with that. Let's do the same thing. So this is growing, and they say there's no enforcement. They see that the laws are not kind of up to speed to try and deal with it. So it's a growing phenomenon, and unless there is action at both the federal and state level, you're going to see more and more of it.
I think the interesting thing on a national level, and I'm sure it's on a state level, you have candidates, if we're going to keep it real, Hillary Clinton, even Donald Trump, they rail against certain special interests in a speech, and then they go have fundraisers with those special interests. Half the time you don't know who's there, you don't know who's donating. It seems like it's not just about disclosure, but because of the floodgates opening, there's a lot less connection to the working class people and a lot more to the special interest and the dark money people. Are you seeing this kind of increasing or making for the worse? Pretty much are politicians being beholden to these interests?
Well, let's be clear. I mean, the wealthy interests in this country have long controlled our politics. I mean, you go back to the days of the railroads, and you go back to even Teddy Roosevelt. One of the reasons that the 1907 law got passed was because of what was happening with the wealthy interests. So,
And for the audience, which 1907 law are you talking about?
the 1907 law that actually outlawed corporations giving contributions directly to candidates. So this is not a new phenomenon nor a new issue, and the country's grappled with it. So that's why I think looking at this in any short-term fashion is actually an inaccurate way to kind of look at how our nation has struggled with this issue from the very beginning. That being said, what's different now is that if you compared what was happening, let's say in the 60s or whatever, before Watergate, there was a lot of money flowing behind the scenes. You had somebody that was known as the senator of GM or the senator from the insurance companies. This was pretty common. But it was a fairly small game. And we were a fairly isolated society. There were many people in our society that were not involved, whether you were African American, whether you were Latino, or you were poor. You were not expected really to participate in the same way as other citizens. We now have a very different view of that. But the change here is the magnitude of the money that's involved, the magnitude of the power that's involved, the expectations of what the federal government and the state governments are actually going to do. We have a Congress, for example, right now, where the average member of Congress spends more than 4 hours of their day raising money. And like any smart person, you go where the money is, just like when you rob a bank. So you're going to spend time with the people that have money. You're not going to spend time with the people that maybe can only give you $50 or $25 or maybe not at all. So what are you hearing if you're a representative? You're hearing the concerns of the people that have the money. So one of the biggest problems in the system is that if you're not one of those players, you don't get to spend that time. You don't get to buy that access. You don't get to make your case. So when we have representatives who seem to be more responsive to the moneyed interests, my answer is, well, of course. That not only, it's not just that they gave money, and so that's, the bribe, that's the concerns they know about. That's who they're spending time with. That's who they're relating to. So if you're a working class kind of, or poor American, the ability you have to have your representative hear and feel and understand your story in a real way, not just a one-off, not like, hi, I'm a photo op, but to really feel it is practically non-existent.
Well, that's what I think there was a misconception about, because the media was seizing after one of the debates between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Bernie was asked, "Can you name one example of a quid pro quo?" And he kind of went back to his general spiel. But to me, it's not so much about a specific. All right, she got a million in her. A million cash, and then she voted for this. It's about the fact that once you surround yourself with a certain class of people, and that's who you relate to.
And the issue here, which I think is this notion of a dollar given and a vote bought, is such a naive way of understanding politics. I've been doing politics for many years. That's not the way the system works. Actually, if you do that, you're not very bright. And you can be like Duke Cunningham, where you write your bribe list on a napkin. Not very bright. What really goes on in politics is who you spend your time with, what concerns you have, who do you feel you need to be responsive to. Look, let's say you have a very large employer in your district that employs 2,000 people. They're going to come in and they want to talk to you. You're going to listen to the owners of that business. Absolutely. They employ a lot of people. They'll probably contribute to your campaign. And I'm not saying you shouldn't meet with them. There are a lot of jobs involved. My question is, what about the workers in that same business? What about their concerns? What about what they see? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't meet with the other people. It's just that unless it's through a union, and unions have their own issues in the political process. Let's say you're not a union worker. Let's just say you're an average white-collar worker or a service worker. Doesn't have a union. How do you ensure that your concerns are at top of mind? The reality is, in this system, with 4 hours a day being spent on fundraising and you're the member of Congress, you don't have the time, the bandwidth, or the capability, or most importantly, the incentive to figure that part out.
And one quote that stood out to me as I've been on the campaign trail, former Congressman Barney Frank says, "Well, what do you want us to do? You want us to unilaterally disarm? I've got money from the banks and this and that. I wasn't influenced." Are you encouraged that the Bernie Sanders of the world, even Donald Trump, he's taking super PAC money, but he also has gotten an influx of small dollar donations. You see Tim Canova in Florida running against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. He's mostly small dollar donations. There's candidates are popping up that can now compete, seemingly based on the message. Are you encouraged by this?
I'm very encouraged by what happened with Bernie Sanders in that, I've been working on this issue a long time, and it has its ebbs and flows. To see so many people on the right and the left who respond to this question that I think has been raised both by Trump and by Sanders of saying, is this really the way we want our politics to work? Isn't there a better way? Isn't there an issue here in the way that candidates are so dependent on these large moneyed interests, individuals as well as companies as well as dark money groups? I think it's great that we're seeing real salience. I mean, people really are saying 80% of both Republicans and Democrats say they think the system is broken. It's both sad but encouraging, because I think there is an opportunity here. But let me tell you, you're fighting an uphill battle on all this because one of the things that moneyed interests do well is they fight back. And when they see a threat to power, this is all about power. Let's be very clear. Politics is about how power is wielded. If you have power, you're usually very reluctant to give it up. So it's really going to be a difficult battle. And I sometimes worry, particularly with the Sanders folks, that they don't understand just how difficult that is. That this kind of desire to go for the big and the bold somewhat misconstrues the difficulty of when you try and do legislative battles. I always remind people in civil rights, there was not one big bill. There was years and years and years of struggle, and you have to be prepared for that. You aren't just going to kind of be able to go out and do one thing, pass a constitutional amendment, and we're done. Yeah. Then you have to pass legislation, interpreting it. Then you have to get regulations. So it's a very, very much of a struggle. And I worry sometimes when I see people get excited about it that they don't quite understand that the struggle is just beginning.
Right. I think a lot of the Sanders supporters that I've seen who are now deflated, very cynical, now that he's endorsed Hillary Clinton, I always say to them, I mean, if I were you, I would be dancing in the streets. A 74-year-old socialist who won 22 states, depending on what you think of the voter issues that happened, maybe more. he took on a political establishment and made a huge crack in it, and honestly is paving the way for the next progressive to maybe even win. But the devil.
If you give up, then you're letting the other side win. That's part of what, when they see their, oh, well, Bernie Sanders didn't win. Well, this wasn't about Bernie Sanders. The way you change a system is you get in there and you fight. And you can't just say, oh, our guy didn't win, and take your toys and go home. You get the democracy that you fight for.
Right. The devil's advocate I wanted to push in. What about the people who say, well, Jeb Bush, look at how much money he had. He got creamed. You look at a lot of these candidates. Scott Walker had money, and a lot of these big money, huge super PACs, dark money, the list goes on. Just came out that Jeb Bush had foreign donations, which isn't exactly legal. They didn't resonate, so maybe money doesn't make that much of a difference.
Well, money's never been the total determinant of who wins. I mean, long before super PACs, long before dark money, maybe some of you might remember when Michael Huffington ran in California for Senate and spent at that time what was an enormous amount of money, almost $20 million, and lost. He was a terrible candidate. So no matter, money is not the determining factor in terms of who wins and loses an election. What we do know is if you don't have money, you're for sure going to lose. But even more important is the impact it has when that person gets in office. And what that does more than anything is it makes sure the door is open. And I know almost any lawyer that I've ever met, whether in a city or in Washington, D.C., they believe if they just have that chance to make their case, they can be convincing. Well, it's a lot easier to be convincing when you're only hearing one side of the case. That's what's going on in Washington, is that because of the access and influence buying, once someone is in office, they're often really only hearing one side in any meaningful way. Yeah, they may hear a little bit, but they're hearing from the other side a lot. Money does not determine who wins elections in the sense of, here's the person that spent the most. But there is a threshold, we know, that if you don't have that much money, you're definitely losing. And if you're a bad candidate, it's kind of like Hollywood. No matter how much money you spend on that movie, if it's a bad movie, people aren't going to go see it. And the same thing applies to some degree in candidate elections.
Lastly, a lot of people think Citizens United is the magic elixir. If we just get rid of that, the problems will be solved. There were problems before Citizens United. So can you kind of expand on, obviously Citizens United is kind of the biggest thing, but are there other issues that would still remain that with or without it?
Right. Well, Citizens United obviously was a very key decision, in my view, was very wrongly decided. Yet another in a list of these 5-4 decisions where, essentially you have the Republican-appointed justices taking one position and the Democratic-appointed a different. So, this is an ongoing trail of cases. I know there are many people who want to overturn Citizens United. My view is I would rather see a Supreme Court who comes in and overturns Citizens United in the next decision. Constitutional amendment is very difficult, but it's also not the only problem in the system. For example, independent expenditures, this notion that they're not corrupting or that they are different, that comes from Buckley v. Vallejo.
Could you explain the independent expenditures?
Well, the notion of an independent expenditure is that it is made totally independent of a candidate. There's no coordination between the person or the entity spending and the candidate on whose behalf the independent expenditure is being done. Usually an independent expenditure is like an ad on TV. It could be other things like direct mail pieces, but generally we see them mostly in terms of advertising. It could be web stuff, by the way. Now, this notion that if you give more than $2,700 directly to a candidate, you are now violating the law and it's corrupting, because the limit is $2,700 to a federal candidate per election, is, okay, more than that's corrupting, the court has said. But if you go in that same race, have a conversation with that same candidate, then go and run $1 million worth of ads on that candidate's television station in their district in favor of that candidate, that's not corrupting. It's ridiculous on its face. That does not come from Citizens United. That comes from Buckley.
I lied. One more question. There was, in this primary, apparently there's been these victory funds between the national parties and candidates for a while, But there were stories done, including my network, that Hillary Clinton and the DNC were basically, coordinating fundraising, and it was supposed to be disseminated down to the states. But then when the money was,
Turn it around
yeah,
and send it back.
yeah, I mean,
Right.
I'm not an expert, but it kind of seems like a little, shenanigans, money funneling. How is that legal?
Well, the joint fundraising committees are again a creation that allows these candidates to basically what I would describe them as pooling their contributor lists. So you can go to these, all join together, decide ahead of time what percentage the party is going to get, what percentage each candidate is going to get, and then they pool them all so that these wealthy donors can just write one check and then be done with it. Then it goes back and they divvy it all up. But what we also know is, let's say 20% of the take for that event was going to go to a state party, okay? What we also know is then the state party can take that 20% cut and funnel it right back into the DCCC or some other, party entity. So it's just a laundry, it's a money laundering system. And it's a way to essentially evade the contribution limits. So you're having this wealthy donor maybe write a check for $500,000. And supposedly it's going all to these different entities, but we all know that it's basically going for a few candidates, including very often in this race, the presidential candidate.
And if one presidential candidate versus the other is participating, and their donors are thus getting a lot of money to the DNC, one would assume the DNC might look fondly at that candidate versus a Bernie Sanders who didn't participate that much in that. They had set up a victory fund too, but Bernie didn't indulge. Seems to me, just common sense wise, if Hillary's donors are sending money into the system, it's going to the states, then going back to the DNC. DNC's pretty pleased with the whole arrangement and possibly more favorable to her.
Well, these joint victory funds or joint fundraising committees really are kind of the quintessential establishment vehicles, because what they're doing is usually saying to incumbents and whoever the favored party official, presidential nominee, et cetera, is, they always join together and they kind of, if you will, I think it's fair to say, not in a non-legal sense, they collude to get all this money in. And so there are times where the joint fundraising committees have been kind of more focused on Senate races, but they're an incumbents tool for the most part.
Well, what do you got to do to break the law in this country? That you said it yourself, it's kind of a money laundering scheme. It seems to me they're not, if a certain percentage is supposed to go to the states and it's not, I mean, that's just okay?
Well, we have something, an agency that is charged by law at the federal level of enforcing that. I call it the Failure to Enforce Commission.
What's the agency?
The Federal Election Commission. And it's actually doing exactly, it's the most successful agency in Washington because it's doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is have 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats on any big issues that are partisan. It splits. There used to be a time where at least on some issues it would act, trying to keep each party honest on the other. Now we have 3 commissioners who don't actually support the law that they are statutorily and constitutionally have sworn to uphold. So their response to that is just basically to dismiss every case because they don't believe in the law. There's an ideological battle, and so when you have that and you have total gridlock at an agency that on any big issue goes 3-3, then it's essentially you don't have a cop on the beat. So it's like saying you can have a law in the books not to rob a bank, but if you never get arrested and there's no cops there to do anything about when you walk out with the money and they don't come and find you, people are going to continue to rob the bank.
Well said. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.